Hello and welcome back to another episode of the One Hood Power Hour. We are officially back from our hiatus. A lot has definitely happened since we've been gone. But we'll be here tonight. First of all, just doing a recap of the elections from May, those primary elections, and we'll be joined by Chris Potter from WESA FM and Alexis Johnson from Vice News. So we're really excited to have that discussion with them tonight. So just starting off with, some of the highlights from that before we even jump into that discussion with them. Both of the local ballot measures were able to pass. One which effectively bans solitary confinement at the Allegheny County Jail, and another one which bans no knock warrants in the city of Pittsburgh. So just to start it off with some good positive news, really excited about that. Additionally, obviously, Ed Gainey was able to pull through and win that mayoral race. So it's looking like Pittsburgh is almost definitely going to have their first black mayor, which is obviously a huge deal. And as well, 5 of the 8 candidates we endorsed as a part of that slate of 8 for the Court of Common Pleas judicial candidates were able to be in those top 9 spots. In the primary election to be on the ballot in November. So we're just really excited about that as well, about, that possibility of having that many progressive judges on the bench. And I'll pass it off to my colleague Miracle Jones as well, just to give a little recap as well, give some hot takes.
Yeah, I think that the primary election had a lot of surprises. In addition to the slate of 8, there's a couple of mayoral races, in Wilkinsburg. Dante Coleman, won. There were magistrate judges who won up and down the slate. So we saw a lot of ground breaking cases. Candidates win the races. We also saw and we think it may be a first in Pennsylvania, but also in America, the first non-binary magistrate individual candidate to win a major race. Also, the first time in Pennsylvania, out in Erie, I believe, was the first time a person of trans experience is going to be running a county as the executive. So there's a lot of stuff that was happening in Pennsylvania that just across the Commonwealth, where there were landmark decisions and landmark cases in addition to the ballot measures. And so we're going to see a lot of litigation around particularly the ballot measure to restrict the power of the governor. That's a discrepancy that people are still arguing over, but that ballot measure did pass. Also, the human rights ballot measure passed, in addition to the 2 local ballot measures. So there's still going to be a lot of things for people to vote for in this upcoming November election, because even though we're talking about the primary season, all of these things going into law means we have to come out again and vote for a lot of these initiatives in November. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what city and county councils' responses are going to be to these new ballot measures, and what changes, if any, the governor is going to take as he battles with the current conservative legislature for control of powers, and what's going to happen with Pennsylvania, as a lot of litigation still is coming through because of COVID-19 procedures and processes that Pennsylvania implemented. And so it's gonna be Pennsylvania is really gonna be like an interesting case study for I think the next year and a half when it comes to our elected officials and our ballot measures and some of the policies and procedures being put forth by our legislature.
Thank you for that, Miracle. And I think on that note, we're going to be bringing in Kahari momentarily as well. But I did want to talk briefly as well about, another one of the major news stories at the local level, that occurred while we were gone and out of the office. Um, and that is, the controversy that occurred in the DA's office with DA Zappala um, instituting a policy to not offer any sort of plea deal to any client being represented by the defense attorney Milton Rayford. Um, and I believe he has since, in response to all of the backlash to that from various elected officials, legal experts, etc. He's withdrawn that ban to this point. But I just wanted to emphasize, since we're talking about the election tonight, just to that this is really indicative of the fact that as great as it is to be able to elect progressive good candidates into a lot of different positions. That's the work doesn't end there. You still have to be able to get people into a lot of these different positions. You still have to be able to hold them accountable. Even if we were able to get our full slate of 8 in, if the DA is then still instituting policies like this, refusing to offer plea deals, things like that, the power that comes from having those 8 progressive judges in can only go so far when you have that type of thing going on. And even with this policy removed now, it still has to be assumed that there's going to be some degree of bias from the DA's office against this lawyer's clients moving forward, which really is not acceptable for that position. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for bringing me in. I apologize. You see, I'm on the move in the rain, so I didn't want to start while I was still behind the wheel. So I'm at a undisclosed location in the city with the fishbowl Hype Williams effect. It looks like, so that's kind of cool. Yeah, I know you guys covered a ton of stuff before. I jumped on, so I don't want to, belabor anything. I did want to, just mention the interesting dynamic happening at the federal level, with the increasing scrutiny around West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin and his pivotal role, particularly in him putting out a op-ed, basically, saying that he is not going to support Senate Bill 1, the For the People Act, which obviously Senator Casey spoke about last night on the Sunday night sit down. So it's going to be very interesting to see how over the coming weeks, how all that's going to play out in the United States Senate. I know there's been ongoing negotiations between President Biden's team and the other senator from West Virginia, Mary Capito, I believe is her name. Who's a Republican senator, trying to come to a bipartisan agreement around For the People, as well as the infrastructure bill. So it's going to be very interesting. A lot of critics on the Democratic side, have argued that Republicans have not shown a willingness to be bipartisan, has not shown a willingness to really come together. So they are upset at Senator Manchin, as well as upset at ongoing attempts, to try to find some sort of bipartisan deal, as opposed to, the Democrats basically waiting for, recess to pass, particularly the infrastructure bill, during a recess, and do it with just Democratic votes. But it appears that Senator Manchin, is not going to vote for anything, moving forward that doesn't have some level, of Republican support. So it's going to be, like I said, increasingly interesting as we see around the country, as we've talked about, on past episodes, how much how many bills are being passed. We see what happened in Arizona, with that so-called audit, and now those same groups, I think they're called now, want to come to, and do that. And we, former President Trump making public statements, continuing to push the big lie, as well as most recently telling confidants that he fully expects to be reinstated into the White House in August. So it doesn't appear, that the big lie is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And, the electoral implications for the voter suppression legislation going around the country could impact 2022, which obviously could then impact, 2024. So it's may, whatever relief folks had in November of 2020 about getting past this chapter, we may, for those Star Wars fans out there, after A New Hope, there was the Empire Strikes Back. So, I don't want to, telegraph that or, predict that, or be a prognosticator, but it's just, it's definitely a possibility. I think vigilance is key, and I don't think folks should put their guard down just because of what happened last November.
Absolutely. And along those same lines, I think, it could really, in addition to that voter suppression component, the inability to get that bill and a lot of these other bills that the Dems have been pushing for through, the infrastructure component, the George Floyd Policing Act, that'll really have, an even broader impact on those 2022 elections and be even more consequential in that regard. Just because if they're not able to align as a party and get anything passed, it's going to be a lot harder to make the case for their reelection, to boost turnout and everything in 2022. So it'll be really interesting to see, even on top of that voter suppression component, if the For the People Act doesn't get through, really how consequential that inability to get things passed could be for 2022.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think that we're going to see a lot more partisan engagement, because even it was impossible to get the commission just to investigate what happened on January 6th. So I think that a lot of people were rightly upset with the senator and talking about you're using bipartisan as a pretext to allow white supremacy to continue and to allow basically Congress to stall on domestic issues. We know there is a vote coming up about what's going on in Israel-Palestine and trying to get aid to Gaza, as well as increasing military aid to Israel. And so that is going to be another contentious federal vote. But, we still have locally our Pennsylvania legislature going back into session, and there's supposed to be a lot of different bills coming up, and there are at least 14 bills that are going to look at how our own elections are going to be run, whether it's going to have shortened, quote unquote, early voting days, whether we're going to have signature matching. And so there's going to be a lot of compromises that we're going to have to be watching just on the local level, in addition to some policing and criminal justice reforms that a lot of community members and advocates are pushing. So everything that's happening on the federal level, plus everything that's happening on the local level, is really why we have to stay engaged in electoral politics from now and then on. And one more thing locally is, the Board of Elections, they just had a meeting. They have said they're going to have a couple of more meetings before the November election to determine whether or not we'll have early voting. We did not have early voting drop boxes and outreach initiatives here in Allegheny County. Part of that was allegedly due to budget constraints. And so now our Board of Election officials are looking at seeing what they're going to do for this November election, and also going into 2022, where we have congressional and Senate races that are slated to be very contentious. And so it's going to be interesting to see which races get more support and which races allow for local municipalities to have that early voting access for citizens. So it's going to be very interesting to watch over these next couple of months of what these policies and procedures are going to be for us here in Allegheny County.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing I just wanted to mention, at the federal level, with all of the drama, that we have discussed over the last few months, I thought it was very interesting for those who are still paying attention to what's going on in Georgia, which I, highly suggest people do. Sitting Governor Brian Kemp, who's running for re-election, was roundly booed at the Georgia GOP convention over the weekend. So it shows, like, no matter what steps he takes, post, making those statements in the past November about how secure and how fair the Georgia election was, and then him trying to kind of go back on that and pass, voter suppression bills, and obviously things that have been covered all over the country, leading to the All-Star game being pulled out of Atlanta. Clearly, his attempts at, trying to appease the Trump base aren't working. So it'll be very interesting to see, as well as Secretary of State Raffensperger as well was roundly booed, by, the Republicans in attendance, at the Georgia GOP convention. I think, which is, to me, a very interesting indicator, of where, the Republican, base is at in many states. And for those who, went on record and told the truth and said it was a fair, free, and secure election, but then have to go back this spring and try to pass voter suppression bills, clearly that's not enough. That's not going to be enough to appease that base. So it's going to be very interesting to understand what the 2022 implications will be, in a environment where we know in 2018, President Trump was not able to motivate his voters, to the polls like he was in 2016 and even 2020. How that, is going to play out in 2022 when the former President Trump is not on the ballot at the same time. The base is maybe discouraged or unhappy, with the incumbents. So now, do the incumbents lose primaries for more extreme candidates, or they get through the primary, and then, does Kemp have to face Stacey Abrams once again with a Republican base that maybe not as enthusiastic about him as they were, in 2018?
Yeah, I think that what we're going to see is people become, like I said, more like partisan, um, and I don't think we're going to see like a Republican Party versus Tea Party split, but I think you're going to see a lot of people come aligned behind Trump as an individual, which is going to be very interesting. Again, for a variety of reasons, there has been speculation about like his fitness and his health, and so it's also going to be interesting to see what happens if he does choose, for whatever reason, not to run again. There's also speculation that his children may also take up the mantle and start running for office as well. And so, for the Conservative Party to have a new identity behind a person and not necessarily ideals, it's going to be very interesting how it does these down ballot races. But I do think you are going to see like more. Not necessarily like extreme, but more people who are not traditional political candidates start to run for office on the conservative side. And it's going to be very interesting for what the GOP is going to do once there are people who have strongly held negative beliefs about people of color, people who are gay, people who are not Christian, start to run and win for office because they have so far included them into their base, and they have allowed that fundraising to go on, whether it's stuff that's happening in Arizona, in Georgia, and Colorado. And so now we're seeing a lot of problematic ideals re-enter into the mainstream. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the GOP is going to respond, because so far, they've stopped the inquiry into the January 6th uprising. They haven't been as vocal in condemning the violent actions or calling for prosecutions. And so it's going to be very interesting what people are going to take from the virtue signaling that the GOP mainstream is doing, and what that means for candidates who are trying to run and be quote unquote bipartisan, because I don't think we're going to see any type of bipartisan work for a few more months.
Absolutely.
But I think that's like, we talked about what's been happening, what's going on. But to do like a recap, we were there like a little bit, but I think our guests had a lot more like insight and in depth what's been happening on the ground and what's going on across Pennsylvania. I've had the opportunity to interview and sit down at different events, and so I think it's going to be very interesting to see what our guests, Kristen and Alexis, have to say. I know, Kahara, you want to introduce them.
Sure. Yeah, we're very excited to bring on our panel, two very esteemed journalists, Chris Potter from WESA-FM, as well as Alexis Johnson from Vice News. I want to welcome them to the One Hood Power Hour.
Hey, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. What he said.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
You think I'd be used to these by now, but I still get like super
That's no problem. Hopefully the next one will be, a round table in person,
for real.
At an adult establishment. Not that kind of adult, but beverages and, bar food.
Actually, if I could just get a back seat in your minivan or whatever that is, Kahari, that'd be cool. It's fine. We could just go see a drive-in or something together.
Yeah, this is the Mazda soccer
We could do
the baseball dad van, the soccer dad van. Straight out of Central.
We could do power hour karaoke, like carpool karaoke, but like we talk politics.
Just like sing like legislation bills.
Absolutely. So definitely, we're so excited, to hear, what you have to say. Let's start, with Alexis. And what I want to start with was the piece, that you did, for Vice. Then we'll go to Chris, and then, we'll talk to Chris specifically. We'll kind of work kind of backwards and then kind of go deeper. But, when we go to Chris, I definitely want to start with your kind of very, I thought was a very powerful day after, conversation, with Mayor Bill Peduto. But starting first, Alexis, you did, a piece, about the election, where you interviewed the mayor, and other folks. So, can you, based on, that work that you did on that piece, I guess my first question is, were you surprised, at the outcome, at the result, based on those conversations that you had specifically for your piece for Vice News?
It was kind of both. Like, I was surprised. I think everybody was surprised. I might have been surprised as anyone to be like, wow, Pittsburgh, you really did it. But I knew that there was a shot. And I really kind of pushed to pitch this piece because, I'm from Pittsburgh. So, being a national outlet, they're like, why are we going to cover this like local mayor's race? And I'm like obviously super biased, right? Because I'm like, I care about it so much. And I'm like, how do I make my national editors in New York care about what's going on with this mayor race in Pittsburgh? But what was interesting to me was like, being from Pittsburgh, I was working in Pittsburgh last year. I saw the energy change in the city towards Mayor Peduto after the protests. And it seemed like for the first time in 8 years, like he became the bad guy. And so I was really curious to see, like, especially after the protests in front of his house and everything that happened at Mellon Park, like I was really curious to see if like all this energy that I was seeing on social media against him was actually going to carry into the election. And like, it kind of was just perfect timing because we had the anniversary of George Floyd's death coming up. And so when I was able to pitch it, I was like, hey, there's a candidate, Ed Gainey, he's gaining a lot of steam. More than any Black candidate that I've seen. And they're like, yeah, so what? And I'm like, well, this is almost certainly because of the events of last year. So like big picture wise, from a national perspective, we were really interested in looking at how the social justice movement and the Black Lives Matter movement last year was impacting local politics. And it seemed like Pittsburgh was just this perfect microcosm of that, especially with the deep-seated issues of race that we have in the city, and policing being a huge issue, and like the report came out about 60% of Black people being arrested, even though they're only 1/4% of the population. So it was kind of all these different factors that we were able to kind of include in the piece. And in my head, I was like, this on the one hand, short answer, I'm glad I was right, like journalistically, like trusting my instincts, because like, you know what I mean? Like I had to go back and tell all my people the next day, like, I told you so. Like I was like, because we did the story, we put it out before the race. So,
Right.
This was kind of just about like a guy who had a chance, and like how, these events made it so that he has like a more of a chance than any other Black candidate. But like we had no idea what was going to happen by the time we put the piece out. So I was surprised, but happily surprised, because I was right. All those things added up to what I was witnessing.
Absolutely. Now, thank you for that. And just quickly, I wanted to go to Chris and then obviously open it up for America and Ryan. I was really taken, by, your piece that you did. I don't know if it was the day after or the following day, after the election, your sit down, with Mayor, Peduto. And at least it struck me that, definitely, maybe two things that struck me. One thing that struck me was the tweet that you put out, the morning of the election. With this statement of, this is going to be, referendum, which kind of shocked me, because me, as someone who's been, in politics for much longer than I like to admit, the incumbent never wants to make the race a referendum. You know what I mean? You want to make a choice, between X and Y, as opposed to, when he came out on the morning, I felt that like clearly they saw, that it was the fourth quarter. And it was a close game, and they might, it might have been a tie game, and Gainey was, to use a football metaphor because we're in Pittsburgh, that he was going down the field, for the winning score, and it seemed like they kind of, felt that. But what was it like for someone who's covered, Bill Peduto, I would say for about 20 years now?
Yeah.
What was it like for you as a journalist who's kind of, seen his, almost entire political arc, and follow him so closely, and then have such a kind of this kind of final, conversation, not final conversation, but kind of like
the stakes weren't quite that high. Yeah. No, I mean, you're right, Kari. I mean, I've known Mr. Peduto since the mid to late 1990s, like when he was like knee high to a ward chair. So it's been like a lot of years. And, I think one of the things he does, and I think you're kind of referring to it, when he met reporters just before he voted, he kind of thinks out loud. And I think everybody knows that an election, when there's an incumbent, seeking re-election, it's always going to be sort of a referendum on that guy. And Bill, in his own way, is sort of honest about that stuff. He also said some stuff that I think kind of fired some people up. He said something like, I asked him, so what's at stake, do you think, in this election? And he said, it's a question of change versus, continuity. And then he said, what it means to be a socialist versus what it means to be a progressive. And there were people who thought that he was essentially red baiting Ed Gainey with that. I don't think that's what he was doing, truth to tell. I mean, I think he had, and I've asked him about it, and this is what he said. And I thought at the time, he was trying to sort of make it a point about sort of where the party is headed, and whether there was still sort of a place for a kind of technocratic sort of liberal who could focus on. And the mayor has a plausible argument in some ways that he was, sort of an early adopter, when it came to the idea like LGBT acceptance and celebration as being like not just something we should do because it's a nice thing to do, but something that actually really enhances a community and makes it a stronger, better place. I think you can go back and say 20 years ago, there weren't a lot of people talking in that kind of way. And he's right to say it. But I think there's this other side of him also that tends to really almost kind of troll the people to his left. He kind of goes out of his way, even with the Zappala situation, which I guess we'll be talking about in a bit, to sort of call out the Twitter hashtag politics or whatever. My favorite debate moment this entire election was when he was criticizing hashtag politics, and then Mike Thompson, the number 4 finisher, this is Mike Thompson's only contribution to the political dialogue, was to say basically, how can you complain about hashtag politics when you spend as much time on Twitter as you do? It's like a great line. But yeah, to come to that point with Bill, and I will say this, is that I think that, the mayor and the people in his camp knew that this was a possibility. Knew that losing was a possibility. They definitely knew that it could happen because they looked around, and I think they felt like they were up against a sort of wave that was coming, and that they didn't even pointing to his previous accomplishments or whatever wasn't going to get it done. It wasn't going to be convincing, that there was something larger at stake. And I think Alexis's piece really spotlighted that in a really effective way. And I'll also say too that as Ryan and Miracle said earlier, this was a choice. This centering of criminal justice reform and racial equity, that wasn't just in the mayoral race. That was up and down the ballot. That was on those local ballot questions. That was the slate of 8. There were, if you cared about this issue, there were any number of races that you could go in and vote on and feel like you were advancing it in a really material kind of way. And that is powerful. We've talked about it on this show before with respect to several of these races. That's a powerful incentive. And what they got hammered by, and they'll tell you they knew the black vote. They knew Ed Gainey was strongly positioned there. He's a ward chair, among other things, longstanding figure in the community. They also got pummeled by a lot of white progressives in places like Bloomfield and Garfield and places like that. A lot of those communities just turned out in big numbers. And so I think, when I talked to the mayor about that, there was a sort of sense on his part, on that day, but before it as well, that like this movement, which he still sees himself as having, done a lot to sort of bring about and to establish here, this movement has kind of gone past him. And I think what's so notable about this victory is, you look at, I've written a lot about, similar wins here. Summer Lee beating Paul Costa, Sarah Innamorato beating Dom Costa, so many of these other races. Those were all against kind of conservative, blue dog, whatever you want to call them, Democrats, who were more conservative than where this party is at. And there were also guys, I will say, who didn't really take the challenge as seriously as they should have. I mean, I would ask these guys, what are you doing differently? And they would be like, nothing. And I was like, you are going to lose. Bill Benuto did not take this for granted. And he is not somebody who's far right on these social issues, and he still got beat. And I think, that is remarkable. And it says, at least in terms of these kind of urban areas, including Erie, some of the election results up there, this party is just moving from the bottom up much faster than even a politician like Bill Benuto, who could tell himself and be right 8-10 years ago, I am on the cutting edge. And now all of a sudden he looks kind of like yesterday's news. Like Alexis said, he was the bad guy last summer, and he did some of that to himself. He did a really ill-advised press conference, I think, where he just sided with the police late at night after that scene in East Liberty. I think that really hurt him. I think he thinks it probably hurt him. But, he'll point to, we did this, that, or the other. Our police only used deadly force 2 times last year, that kind of stuff. It wasn't Mayor Daley's Chicago for sure. Right. But I do think that he just got left behind by this movement. And I think that's a thing that he's going to kind of struggle with and kind of work through. And has been kind of doing since really the campaign began.
Chris, it's interesting that you say that you think that he might regret some of the decisions, because obviously we only have a couple minutes to put this piece together, but I talked to the mayor. I mean, I have an hour of transcript between him and I, and, he kind of like, I gave him the opportunity to be like, what would, should you have done anything differently? And like, what do you think about the protesters coming to your door? And he was very defensive, he was like, he was pushing responsibility off. He was like, I don't understand why they came to progressive mayor's houses. I saw it across the country.
And he still says that.
They should have been going to conservatives' houses, and I can't do much about the police. That's the state legislators' problem, and that sort of thing. And he really had an opportunity to be like, we might have, but, and then he kind of was like, well, there's a lawsuit, so there's only so much I can say. So I guess maybe he couldn't admit guilt on camera. But he seemed to be like, he seemed to stand by it, and at least in the conversation that I had about.
I think in general that's true. Yeah, I think in general that's true. I do think that probably, as he looks back on, I was referring sort of specifically to that press conference in particular. Right. I mean, he basically went in there without really knowing what was going on there, and he has an excuse for that as well. That essentially what he said, that the thing he kind of got hung on was the use of smoke. He said that, we hadn't used chemical spray. And of course that turned out not to be true. His representation to me was individual officers on the ground. There was a decision made on the ground, but it didn't come from the top down. It's just kind of like, people People don't buy that. They don't care. And the smarter move, I think, in retrospect, would have been to wait a little bit, to not put himself so far out on the line. But I agree with you. For the most part, he believes in how they handle those protests. He believes, some of the stuff, Alexis, that he said to you before the election, he was still saying after it. So yeah, I mean, the guy is not ashamed of his performance or anything like that. I still think he thinks that, as I said, part of this was a wave, and that's maybe one of the things you tell yourself, right? If it's a wave, maybe there wasn't much you could do. And I think that is part of his mindset. But I think really very strongly he does sense that, look, this party has just gone to a different place, and he is somewhere else now than where it is. And I think that's really what he meant when he was talking about what's a progressive versus what's a socialist. And the problem is because he's, it's strange for a guy in politics that long. They didn't really think more carefully about how that was going to sort of come across to some of the audiences, especially those who are already, sort of motivated to vote against him.
Right.
Absolutely. We're gonna go.
And so,
go ahead. Go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Kahari. So just going back to that point that Alexis, that you were making, both of you really, just about how, it not only was it, the police response initially that really hurt Peduto, but it was also just his insistency on really continuing to double down on that, continuing to be really defensive about it, and just, dismissive of a lot of the critics and organizers who criticized him for it, and then, got behind Gainey and were really important in driving that push. And I think that's something that really even had to be clear to Peduto and his camp, that, his hardline stance on this was something that was really hurting him leading up to the election. So, just to get your thoughts on why he was so committed to maintaining that stance, if it was if he just, overestimated the gap between him and Gainey, if he was just that stubborn to die on that hill, or if there was some sort of strategy there, I don't know.
I think he was just, I think a lot of, and he said this, like I said, I have an hour of, I wish I could have added more, honestly, but I think he was just really personally hurt that, he had saw the city that he will tell you he's worked for 30 years, all of a sudden turn on him because of all those factors that Chris named, because, he was the leader of this. He was the first liberal to do A, B, and C in this city. So I think he was just no, I'm not going to let this, mob or whatever he calls it, defeat me or make me change my mind on anything I've done. He talked a lot about his mental health and how the social media attacks that he gets does really keep him up at night, for better or for worse, and how he thinks it's a nasty time that we're in. He said to me specifically, the part that we kept was, he was yeah, a lot of these activists are people who've never stepped foot in a Black neighborhood. I mean, all that stuff to me just says he's really personally affected by what was going on. So I think he just was nah, I'm not gonna change my mind on any of this, or he kind of just stood by it, because I think he felt if he gave into it, that all that chatter wins, then the social media people that are attacking him on Twitter every day, they win. And he just wanted to really believe in his record and what he has done for the city. He doesn't have a terrible record. So he kind of just stood by that and hoped it was enough. But I think it really was personal for him, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I can tell you is somebody who, I think I'm the first reporter who got yelled at by Bill Peduto when he was mayor in a press conference. And I can tell you that one thing the mayor has never liked is sort of being questioned from the left. Donald Trump can rail against him. All those Breitbart people can say whatever they want, and it's like water off a duck's back. But to get challenged from the left has always been a thing for him. And I think too, with respect to policing, one of the things I think he did, as he said to me, he probably said to Alexis, and as the number of support, if you look at, say, the number of complaints filed to OMI, the sort of internal affairs department, or the police review board, generally speaking, there has been a statistically not insignificant decline in the number of those complaints. Now, whether you want to use that as the motto, as the kind of standard for judging, I don't know. I mean, the number of arrests overall in the city of Pittsburgh declined. Now, it declined at a slower rate for Black arrestees, but it declined. Fewer people are being arrested of any race right now than were when Bill Peduto took office. And I think, he's going to stand by that record, and understandably so. It's what he has. I mean, the irony of this for the mayor, of course, is that it's not like the police were big fans of his, right? I mean, he took a lot, and he took a lot of flack from the aforementioned Stephen Zappala as well. I mean, Zappala dropped a bomb on him like right at the very outset of this campaign. So, if you can see where a guy might start to feel a little bit besieged by all of this, right? He's being criticized for not doing enough to police reform, and yet he's got years of just sort of kind of these police having these issues with him. And I think because of, how he's always sort of been wired, that this is tricky for him to get challenged from the left I think it affects him in a much different way, precisely because he sees himself as having been sort of their gladiator, their champion in so many of these fights.
Yeah, I think that it's like very interesting to hear that, because I think a lot of the conversation was not about who was first or who was last to do whatever policy. It was an acknowledgement that some of the policies were failing people. And what are you going to do for those individuals who are going through and being left behind? Like, it's great that we have a policy about, tear gas or whatever, but that canister hit somebody, right? So, like, what are we doing? And I think we also see that a lot of politicians have a communications nightmare, which I think is like great for like the media and for like stories, but it's like you didn't see Peduto saying sorry. You didn't see Peduto going to the hospital, sitting with protesters. You didn't see him having the conversation at the round table with victims of police violence. Things that other mayors have done to kind of like, even in Minneapolis, the mayor, he allowed people to boo him. He went out to the protest, right? You didn't really see Peduto doing that. I think that's also part of it, is people have to kind of campaign differently, and maybe are not necessarily wanting to do that, like, of course, in the global pandemic. But I also was wondering, when you're looking at some of these candidates, have you seen a type of like assessment of like, okay, well, maybe, not necessarily it's me, but maybe there's recognition that some of these policies just weren't as progressive or as expansive as we thought they could be?
Chris, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know that. So what you're saying is, has there been kind of a soul-searching moment on the part of Bill Peduto or politicians like him? Is that what you're asking?
That you've talked about, that you've interviewed, just the people, like, and it may not come, or whatever. But I was wondering if talking to you've covered a lot of these all the candidates, kind of like
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think there are varying levels of it. I mean, one of the things we also saw in this election was the two city councilors who were facing opposition. Both won quite easily, and they tended to be two of the more conservative members of city council. So it's we can't necessarily even talk about Pittsburgh as a monolith in this kind of way, right? And I don't know. I think different politicians are sort of making different calculations on all that kind of stuff. I think you raised a really good point, Miracle, which is that a sort of lack of, I hate to use the word empathy because it sounds so squishy, but that lack of connection. I think. I mean, Ed Gainey what's the first thing everybody would always say about Ed Gainey? Ed Gainey shows up, like he'd be there, right? And I think that he has that, and it's a gift, and it's not a small one. That he has that ability to kind of connect with people in that way, and in that sense, it was such a strong contrast with the mayor who has never really been great at that stuff, in my opinion. It's just kind of not who he is. Not everybody is. Tom Murphy, former mayor, same kind of way, was succeeded by Bob O'Connor. People do want somebody who they feel like feels them on that kind of level. And Mr. Peduto, like Mr. Murphy, is kind of a technocrat in a lot of ways. So I think like that has a lot to do with what happened here as well. This is a moment where people are, waking up across the spectrum to stuff that I think we have not talked about for many, 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 many years. I don't know. Some politicians, some parts of the Democratic Party are responding to that. You were talking nationally before. Others, maybe not so much. It's a weird time for Democratic politics because, part of why 2020 happened the way it is, they got a lot of, suburban folks who were just sick of Donald Trump or whatever. But, I don't know. That's a tough coalition to hold together, maybe, right? And I think you'll see different Democrats kind of making different decisions about it, about how to do it. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more specific answer than that. I think it really varies across from race to race, from candidate to candidate.
Yeah, and Alexis, I did have because I had a conversation with Gainey about this a little bit about intentionally running a positive campaign, so not doing attack ads. And we saw that with Warnock. We're seeing a lot of particularly Black candidates refusing to do attack ads, a lot of based on not wanting to do racial stereotyping. But are you seeing that across the country? Because I know you're traveling, you're doing electoral politics all throughout. Is that a pattern you're also seeing? Because we're seeing a lot more Black candidates running, but it seems to be this very happy, picture perfect community. We can all come together, we're going to engage. Is that another trend that you're seeing?
I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but maybe I haven't seen. I probably have to go back and check, but maybe I haven't seen that. I was down in Georgia for the Senate race, and you're right. We were there the night, and the next day was the insurrection, right? Which was pretty nuts. So my story just completely was way down the bar on news that day. The fact that Warnock and Ossoff had won. But when I was in Georgia and I'm in the hotel and I'm watching the ads, the ones from Loeffler and the other guy, Purdue, yes, Purdue. They were so ridiculously nasty. I don't even know if the Dems are running on anything positive, or that the contrast is they were in the Trump playbook, they were just edited, it almost looked like I forget the guy's name that gets arrested all the time for the conspiracy videos on YouTube, but it was that kind of stuff on TV, and they would cut it, AOC's voice into something that she didn't say, and somehow it had anything to do with Warnock. It was they are socialists and they are going to make you, and it was just what is this ad? It was almost like a spoof. So I think that probably is intentional to be we're not even going to play into that, because Chris talked about, it's that contrast that they can almost lean into because of the Trump politics is play dirty, go low, be insulting, lie, and if you can just kind of stick to the good old regular political ad that isn't just complete insanity. They were every 2 minutes there was an ad when I was in Georgia for that was anti Ossoff and Warnock, and they were just completely who would even believe this kind of stuff that they were putting out? But that was their game, and they lost. So I think people are starting to notice that the Trump people are talking to a specific group of people also. So I think the Dems have a challenge to get more people, and you don't want to probably get more people with honey than you would with vinegar, I think, in that case.
I would say the one complicating factor here on the local level was this was really, I think, the first mayoral election that I've covered where independent expenditure groups played a significant role. And you had those groups. There was one supporting Mayor Peduto, and there was one supporting Representative Gainey. The toughest ads, the toughest attacks on Representative Gainey came from that that independent expenditure pack. And the Peduto people will say, oh, we can't control when those folks say there's not allowed to be, kind of coordination or whatever. And that's true as far as it goes. But, I think people kind of say you're still benefiting from these kinds of attacks, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it'll be interesting, in a few weeks, we'll get kind of our first shot at the post-election accounting. And it'll be very interesting to see how much money eventually did get spent on those races, because, one of the things that Mr. Peduto prides himself on is, campaign finance limits and reporting limits for city office seekers. And these outside groups just make a mockery of that. I mean, Ed Gainey benefited from probably $350,000 or more in money spent by one union alone, SEIU Healthcare. It'll be interesting to see how they spent it. I think they spent a lot more on online ads than Bill Peduto did. My 10-year-old son was like, I knew Ed Gainey was going to win because I never saw a commercial from Bill Peduto when I was watching Oliver the Beagle videos on YouTube. So yeah, and that's a key. That's Oliver the Beagle fans are a key constituency, I guess. But I wouldn't be surprised if they spent a lot of it on get out the vote efforts and things like that as well. And, I think that stuff is something we're going to be reckoning with. We're so used to kind of hearing it at the national level for federal races. So the fact that it's kind of percolated down to this local level, again, those ads tend to be more negative as a general rule because they don't have as much at stake. Tim Stevens got ticked off at the group supporting Ed Gainey because he didn't consent to appear in their ad, and they had the right to use his image. They, it wasn't, they didn't even tell you what his name was, but people recognize him. But, they just don't have that same kind of connection. If you're an outside spending group, you don't have to make nice to Tim Stevens a week after the election. You got a job to do, you do it, and then you move on. So I think that will be interesting to see what effect that has on every race that takes place on a local level going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to bring back, a point that you mentioned that reminded me of Election Day. Me and Ryan and Miracle went out with a DJ QRX and had basically a mobile DJ caravan throughout the city, just reminding people, that it was Election Day, and we had, made it to Bellevue, Westview, and dropped off the U-Haul, and we were driving down Dallas Avenue in Point Breeze with the cemetery on the right and Point Breeze proper on the left, and this was about 6 something, and Ryan says, what do you think is going to happen? I just happened to look over. It was a corner of Dallas, and I think Northumberland, for those who are familiar with there, and it was just like a little duplex, and I would say it was probably a white woman in her mid to late 40s sitting on the stoop, and there was an Ed Gainey sign in the yard. I remember saying to Ryan, I think Ed got this because that's a Peduto voter, like just from the world that I come in. And for those, who don't know, as Chris knows, I was, one of the first, recruits to the Peduto Army many, many moons ago, so I've kind of watched, from inside the bubble and outside of the bubble, once, I was summarily escorted out of the bubble in 2013. I've seen it from both sides, and I was just like, that's because I just remember, as Chris knows, back in 2005, that was the type of person that was walking into that pizza shop in the strip district, and the other thing that I'll mention, and I'll give it back to Miracle and Ryan, to ask questions is like, and there's a very famous photograph, that was taken by, I'm forgetting his name, but there's a very famous photo of the Peduto campaign in 2005 that Larry Ripple, local photographer, had posted, and it has the original gang, Beerless, Dan Gilman, Matt Preston, as well as his wife Tiffany, David Dix, Dave Mansueto, Nisa Bond. I mean, all these people that many of whom you haven't seen, in many years, but others more, like Deb Gross, and then you can start picking off people in the photograph that were supporting Ed Gainey. And to me, looking at that picture was such a striking kind of microcosm of Alexis, what you and Chris have been talking about, this transformation of going from, kind of, the pioneer of the progressive movement to becoming, no longer that. And seeing so many people, even like Chuck Pascal and Randy Francisco, just to pull some names of folks who in 2013 were so enthusiastically behind Bill Peduto, posting pro Ed Gainey stuff, posting anti-Peduto stuff, in the waning days. I remember, Chuck Pascal, sued Jack Wagner in court, to challenge his spending limits, and to see the man who defended Bill Peduto in court 8 years ago now bashing him, supporting his opponent, just showed you how quickly, the tables can turn in politics. But I'll leave it back to my colleagues.
Yeah, I was wondering, Chris, have you heard anything about what the mayoral race is going to look like? Because we're still trying to figure out if Tony's going to, or Mr. Moreno, is going to run as the Republican candidate. Right. We still have Will Parker as the write-in mayoral candidate. So have you heard anything about that? And also turning quickly to the school board, for our school board members who cross-registered and are now running as Republicans. Have you heard anything about what those campaigns are going to be looking?
So yeah, we'll take the first. So you're quite right, Tony Moreno, and this is something I was sort of warning people was likely to happen. Tony Moreno, who ran, the retired police officer, finished third in the Democratic primary, received enough write-in votes to be the Republican nominee if he wants to. He has not. He has not indicated whether he will do so. I would be very surprised if he would. What the process is the county sends him a letter and says, congratulations, Mazel Tov, you're the write-in candidate to be the Republican nominee if you want it, and then he has to write a letter back saying, yes, I would like to be the Republican nominee. He has not said that he will do that, and he is not. I'm not even sure that letter has been sent out, but at any rate, I don't believe it's been returned yet. His wife posted something, I think either on election day or the day after, that said, don't throw away those Tony Moreno for mayor signs or whatever. There have been some other signs as well of that kind of thing. Mr. Moreno hasn't taken me into his confidence about what he plans to do. I would be a little surprised if he doesn't do it. I would have been surprised if he wasn't the nominee. And I'll be surprised if he doesn't take up a chance to do that. Obviously the chances of winning are vanishingly small, I would think. The only factor, the only kind of X factor here is, there was a report by WTAE TV a few weeks before the election suggesting some campaign finance improprieties involving a political committee sort of tied to Ed Gainey. I mean, I'll say that nothing that I saw reported by WTAE would suggest, even if every word of it was absolutely true, would I think implicate Mr. Gainey at all. It had to do with the filing of reports and a failure to correctly report contributions and expenditures. Ed Gainey doesn't have a responsibility for filling out those forms. The only you could imagine though, and supposedly the county police, took a referral from the Board of Elections there to look at that. One could imagine, I suppose, some set of circumstances in which something might come up that would, speak to Mr. Gainey's involvement or whatever. I don't know any of that. I'm just saying, if there was a scenario in which you could imagine a Tony Moreno candidacy, that might be the only thing that I could even think of. Other than that, it's really hard to imagine that being a race. Republicans have run before in November. They tend to just not get very much traction. Mr. Gainey won by a convincing margin. I mean, it really wasn't that close. He won by 7 points over an incumbent. So ordinarily, I don't, as long as the rules of conventional politics apply, I don't expect that to be much of a race, honestly. As for the school board, I mean, you raised to me, this is actually the race, the sort of unsung race of this ballot. We try to do a little bit on it, but it's tough to write about school board races. We have seen there were a couple of challengers from a group called, I think it's Black Women for Better Education. I might be getting the exact committee name off there a little bit, who did beat Democratic incumbents for school board races. Tracy Reed beat Terry Kennedy, a longtime incumbent there. Gene Walker beat out Veronica Edwards, I think, in District 9. Both of those incumbents are cross-registered, as you point out, as Republicans, and they won those two races. So there will be a rematch there coming up. Again, it's a school board race. They tend not to get a lot of oxygen. The one ordinarily you'd say, no chance. Because they're they're Republicans running in Democratic town or whatever. The only thing that might be in their side is we no longer have straight ticket voting. You used to be able to just push one button, click one lever, and you'd vote the whole Democratic slate. You don't do that now. You kind of have to go through. So it may be that there's some incumbent, still the name recognition of being an incumbent might help them a little bit on that side. But, again, you win on the Democratic primary, you have a pretty good chance of winning in November. And I think that could be a big deal because the Tracy Reed and some of these other candidates from this pack, very critical of the management of the school district under Superintendent Anthony Hamlet. They may well kind of shake up this school board and take it in a direction. I covered several years ago when a slate of candidates backed by the teachers union won races and basically changed the majority to sort of a pro-teacher majority. We may be seeing now, 6 years later, like that pendulum sort of beginning to swing back. We'll have to see in this fall, but I think it's potentially a really important race because the school district, as we all know, is just woven into the fabric of this city. It's why people choose to move to a place or move away from it. And so it's just a huge factor here that I think none of us have paid enough attention to, and I include myself in that category.
Yeah, and so just building off what you were just talking about with with those Black Women for Better Education endorsed candidates, pretty much splitting the primary nominations, with candidates endorsed by the teachers union. And then you see, similarly, slate of 8 endorsed candidates performing about as well. This is something you mentioned as well, about as well as the candidates endorsed by the Allegheny County Democratic Committee. And this is something we kind of touched on the last time you were on here as well, as far as kind of the waning influence of that endorsement, and maybe the kind of that shift in political and electoral influence to different types of organizing, different types of endorsements. So just do you think these outcomes of this primary are indicative of some long-term shift in that regard? And that might be impacted by that outside spending that you talked about earlier as well, one way or the other. But
I mean, I think so. It's pretty hard to argue at this point. You could dismiss one or two of these as a fluke. You could dismiss Bethany Hallam winning a countywide race because who the hell pays attention to county council? You could dismiss Summer Lee, beating Paul Costa if you wanted because Paul was old and tired and didn't care. I mean, any one of these races, you could kind of say, but I mean, they just toppled a 2-term incumbent mayor. I mean, an incumbent mayor hasn't lost in the city of Pittsburgh for almost a century, right? Like that is huge. And Rich Fitzgerald's term limited. So who's to say, what might be next coming down the pike? I mean, it's a big deal in these alternate modes of organizing. You're right. The judicial races prove it, that it can be done. So yeah, I mean, it will be interesting. I mean, one interesting test of the Gainey administration will be, okay, now you've got the reins of power here. What are you going to do with them? And I think that'll be an interesting, test for the city, for this movement, for everybody involved with it. It'll be interesting to see who he picks for his chief of staff. I hear some names that I'm told are really solid people. So there's there's already some news percolating up about that. That'll be pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think this is potentially, I don't know where it stops. Let's put it that way. I don't know where it stops. And that's what makes it like really an exciting and interesting moment if you're covering politics.
Okay, thank you. I had a quick question for Alexis, going from local, to national, and it started with hyperlocal. We see, in the city of Pittsburgh as well as in Allegheny County, Leah Duncan Williams, the first African-American, Leah Williams Duncan, rather, who's the first African-American woman elected to a magistrate seat. And then again, we talked about, the 5 women in the slate of 8, but to focus on, Rena Watson, Tiffany Sizemore, and Nicola Henry Taylor, where they're going to triple the Black women representation on the bench in one primary, essentially. If, obviously, if they carry through. And then at the state level, Tamika Lane and Lori Dumas. From your perspective at the national level, are you seeing a similar trend? With African-American women, running for office, and what we've seen, the past couple of weeks in Western Pennsylvania as well, statewide, with the 2 judges from Philadelphia getting through the primary. Is this something that you're also seeing on the national level as well as a trend?
Yeah, absolutely. Because even when I was, kind of doing the research for the Pittsburgh story, I was trying to see if Ed Gainey fit in this national trend of, people running for, Black people running for mayor. And I think maybe the Washington Post or the Hill or somebody had compiled a list of maybe 6 or 7 Black candidates that were in major cities. But we didn't end up including that. But I give it all to the movement last year. I mean, not to say that they wouldn't have ran, who knows? And it's so interesting because when I asked Representative Gainey, was it because of this movement that you ran? Sometimes he was like, yes, of course. And sometimes he was like, no, I was already thinking about it. So, people may have always thought this is something that I want to do, but now is my chance, or now is my moment, or maybe I can take down an incumbent in my major city because of what happened last year, because of this progressive movement, and because people are kind of the base and the voters are not afraid to be progressive out loud, you know what I mean? Or, get shunned at the coffee shop. Like, maybe these may be issues that people have cared about forever in Pittsburgh, but you know how the climate is here. So so now they're like, oh great, I can come out and vote for these things. And I think that has really pushed a lot of people, like I said, like across the country, to vote in a lot of local ballots. I wish I could name them off the top of my head, but it's definitely something that we've been trying to keep an eye on. Like, I wish we could cover all of them, but that's definitely been happening for sure.
Thank you. I know we got 10 minutes left before we break, but Miracle, do you have a look like you had a burning question? Maybe I misread your facial expression.
Oh no, look, I did, and I did. I know this kind of not necessarily electoral questions directly, but we've seen in recent weeks a lot of conversation about when and what journalists should be reporting on, how journalists should be engaging politics and these decisions and these policies, even with the AP and coming down. And I was wondering, as two reporters who talk to people who are engaging, like, how do you approach these subjects? How do you approach sharing the information? Obviously, what tweeting has done, for you, Alexis. We know that story, and how we are still, dealing with the fallout in Pittsburgh. Like, I'm wondering, like, do you internally see these pressures within the field of media about how to adequately and accurately relay these stories, so that when these results happen, people aren't always surprised, because you're like, oh, we see all the signs everywhere. We now we understand why people are engaged and out there. But I think also because people still want that objectivity, a lot of times these upsets aren't really upsets. It's just that they can't be accurately reported on because people still want to be objective. And I was wondering if we can get your feedback on that, if it's not too political of a topic to comment on.
No, that's interesting. I've been anti-objectivity for the last year now, so I think it's a myth. No, yeah, I mean, it's it's tough. It really is tough. It's a tough position to be in. I think, like I said, with my situation, and I wasn't the only journalist who kind of fell into this discussion of objectivity over the last year. We just saw it at the Washington Post with a reporter who was punished for because she was a victim of sexual abuse at one point, and they told her she couldn't cover those types of stories anymore. I mean, I think because of the racial reckoning, I mean, I don't think my situation would have gotten as much traction if it wasn't also for George Floyd's death, and the Black Lives Matter movement was kind of this perfect storm. So I think now there's a lot less pressure maybe on journalists, or maybe more of a platform to be hey, this isn't right, because this has been going on for all this time, and we're human, and you're not going to tell a woman who has a kid in a school, a journalist who has a daughter in a school district, that she can't cover that school because her kids go there. You know what I mean? It's we live in this community, and that's why we're covering it. And so we're going to have an opinion on how things are. And it's, the bottom line is to tell the truth. And I think there's a difference between being objective and being fair, right? For me to be slanted in that story, it would have been me throwing all my personal love behind one candidate or another, or showing one candidate more than the other, or making one look really bad. And I really thought I gave both of them a really fair shot, to defend themselves, and they said what they said, so it might have seemed like one person looked worse than the other, but that's fairness. For me to be slanted would be I'm only going to talk to this one candidate, and let's make this all about the black guy who could change the whole city. You know what I mean? And not even give Peduto or anybody a chance to defend themselves, or whatever the case may be. So I think that objectivity thing is a myth that needs to die, because there's a huge difference between being objective, which is almost impossible, because we all have our own implicit biases as a person, and you bring that to your writing and your work, and it makes the work stronger, because I understood what was going on in Pittsburgh from a Black perspective. You know what I mean? I understood what this movement meant for Black people in Pittsburgh, and was able to kind of put that nuance into the story. But I don't think that made it subjective or not fair. There's still plenty of facts in there, and both sides got the chance to tell their stories equally. So I think in this climate, it is still kind of a dance, but I think because of everything that has happened in the last year, more reporters are speaking out against those rules that are really just, it's like, who are we afraid to offend? You know what I mean? Like, who are
Everyone
we trying
hates
to
us anyway.
here? Yeah, exactly. Like, who are we trying to, yeah, because it's damned if we do, damned if we don't.
Yeah.
Like, you know, we're the enemy at the end of the day, no matter which side we support. So like, we kind of just got to always like block out all that BS and like just really try to be as fair as possible. But I think there's a huge difference between that and being objective. I think objectivity is impossible.
Yeah, and it's never, I mean, put aside the actual content of the story. Just think about like back when there were actually print newspapers. You know, what story did you put above the fold on page 1? That's a value judgment. It's about what story do you think is the most important thing for your audience to know about. That there's no way that isn't a value judgment. There's no way who gets the first quote, who gets the last quote, who do you quote in full, who do you paraphrase? All of those things, they're inherently subjective judgments.
Yeah. And every editor will give you something different, you know, a different answer.
Especially at the Post-Gazette. Usually it's
pile of facts to 4 people in the newsroom, you'll get 4 different stories. I mean, that's just how it is.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, you know, and I came from an alt weekly tradition originally, so we also don't have quite the same, you know, we don't genuflect towards this altar of objectivity either. And it, you know, it's sort of interesting to think that as in the history of American journalism, like objectivity is like not, it's a fairly recent innovation, right? For a long time, like a city like Pittsburgh was served by like 3 or 4 newspapers at a time. And they were like, some of them had specific explicit party leanings. That's why there's like the Johnstown Democrat was like the name of it, because it was the Democratic paper. So, you know, people who know this better than me will tell you that, you know, objectivity was a way of rationalizing if one paper bought another. Oh, see, like it's, you know, there was a way of making it okay for media consolidation. Look, we can serve everybody equally. We're objective. It was a marketing strategy, in other words. We clearly, the business model has clearly changed. Witness the power of, you know, the success of Fox News. And I think part of what you're seeing is, anyway, is people kind of looking at that and just saying, you know, what are we doing here? We're holding on to these values that were really problematic to begin with, aren't convincing anybody, and we're bending over so far, we're contorting ourselves so much to live up to this impossible thing that we're actually not connecting with the audiences that we need to inform. And I think that's that's part of this challenge here, this moment that journalism is in. I mean, look, I'm 50 years old. It's a lot is changing like right around me. And again, I'm from an alt weekly, so you would think I would have an easier time with it, but there's just a lot going on. And the way a younger generation of journalists is doing this stuff is different. And it's not worse. It's just different. And it's responding, I think, to a different set of facts on the ground. And some of these old rules just go by the boards.
Thank you. We'll give it to Ryan for the last question, and then we'll close out the evening.
Yeah, thanks, Kahari. And I did want to ask real quick, you know, just because this has become, you know, seemingly in the last couple of elections, an increasingly popular trend as far as passing, you know, different things related to criminal justice and policing reform with the ballot measures, both in this election and in last election. And so I was just wondering, you know, to get either of your thoughts on, you know, whether you think that's going to continue to be, you know, an increasingly popular way of getting these type of reforms passed that might not be able to otherwise, either on that specific issue, or if you see that expanding and becoming, you know, more of a popular approach to different issues across the board as well.
I think it's almost going to have to be, right? Because like all this stuff is on the local level anyways. I mean, like we can talk about what's going on at the White House and the federal bill and the George Floyd Policing Act, but like they got to deal with the filibuster and all this other stuff. I mean, it's like that is like a totally different thing. Like they can bicker all you want, but like if they, you know, like the ballot measure passes to do A, B, and C, then that's what's going to be effective. That's what's going to happen in that particular city, no matter what. So it's like, it's going to have to remain on the local level. Like people are going to have to keep talking about it from a local perspective and voting on it on a local level, because that's where it all happens anyways. So I don't think there's I mean, if this stuff is going to change, it's definitely going to have to be because you got one mayor that, you know, views his police department different than the other mayor or whatever the case may be. Because all of them, like we're talking about objectivity, those are all choices, you know, those are all subjective choices that one guy in power or one woman in power is going to have to make. And so federally that might be a totally different thing, but if anything is gonna change, I think it is happening. But if it's not on a local level, it'll all die out, I think.
I would add the caveat that a lot of this policy is made at the state level, and those of us who live in Pennsylvania know it's really hard to do much at the state level because Republicans have very skillfully been able to draw themselves really favorable districts. They've been in control of the state House for many years, for the state Senate for all but 2 years out of the past 20 or 30. I'll also say, and when you get in the state level, we kind of have to think outside the power of a mayor or whatever, right? I grew up in the suburbs. I've seen suburbanites in their native habitat, and I'm not 100% sure that my tribe that I grew up around is as invested in criminal justice reform as this moment might suggest. One thing Republicans have done very successfully is pander to, exacerbate suburban fears of crime. We saw this in the 1990s a lot. Part of this movement that's happening, part of why I think it can happen is that crime rates have been so low for so many years. And people are sort of allowing them, I'm sort of being sarcastic here. People are allowing themselves the luxury to think about whether the system is even fair. But should crime rates go up again, you can imagine a situation in which that might happen. Would there still be that commitment to fairness, or would people allow their fears to sort of overwhelm their sense of, kind of what criminal justice should be and what's effective and what's humane and what's right? I don't know. I really don't know. And I think, we've seen at least, here and there some spikes in crime rates or whatever. You've already seen some attempts by Republicans to, blame sanctuary cities, blame Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. It didn't obviously work this election at all. But will it translate on a statewide level when we elect our next attorney general? I don't know. These are kind of the questions that I have when I kind of think about what is the long-term trend here. Is this the beginning of something, or is this kind of the apex of something? And I don't know, because I've just seen this kind of pendulum play out the other way too. And so I'm a little wary of making a prediction for that reason.
Yeah. I do think this moment is different, though. It's not.
This isn't
a regular pendulum, I think there's something about this moment that feels different. So we'll see. I think if there was ever a chance for momentum to continue, I think it is now.
Thank you so much, Alexis Johnson from Vice News, as well as Chris Potter from WESA. Thank you so much. Looking forward to talking to you again as we move into the fall election and obviously 2022. The hits do not stop; they keep coming. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'm going to
thank you so much for having me.
Miracle to close us out as usual. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you to our esteemed guests for joining us. Again, if you are interested in what we're talking about, please make sure you're registered to vote, because we have to vote for these people in November. This week, our 100 Media Network team, we have some programming for you. Wednesday at 6 o'clock, we have This Week in White Supremacy. Thursday at noon, we have On Tilt talking about mental health in America. And Friday, we have Black Light with Farouk Al-Saeed and featuring JM the Poet, just talking about some upcoming music and events that are happening. Not this week. Next week, we are partnered with City of Asylum for Juneteenth. We're going to, on June 18th, the day before Juneteenth, we are partnering with City of Asylum to do art and liberation events. It's going to be open to the public, so you can come in, buy art, look at art. There's going to be performances, there's going to be foods, and it's open to the community. So please come and join us at City of Asylum on the 18th. Again, thank you so much. Please support, like, subscribe to our One Hood Power pages. We are going to be launching our website very shortly, so we do need your support. So please make sure you are donated to One Hood Power. We are a 501c4 nonprofit organization, as well as 100 Media, who's a 501c3 organization, and both of those make up our One Hood Network supports that we are doing. So please make sure you are engaging, coming back to all of our content. And let us know if there's people you want to hear us talk to, an issue we didn't get to, or an issue you want us to delve more into. Contact us, slide in our comments, send us a DM, and we will look to you to create better content that you would like to watch and view on your screens and on your computers. With that, back to Kahari.
Absolutely. And again, special thanks to Alexis Johnson from Vice News and Chris Potter from WESA for joining us once again, and for a very just enlightening discussion tonight. So until next Monday, stay safe, stay engaged, stay involved in the process, and thank you for joining us. Good night.